So as mentioned, we're going to be talking about probably the hot topic of today, which is the US election. I heard quite a lot of people over coffee already discussing this topic. Obviously, it's far too close to call. We're not going to presume to talk about who we want to win, who we think might win. What we are going to talk about is what it might mean for crypto in this election. It's sort of been the first, in a way, crypto election, the first one where the candidates have actively, I think, and overtly courted the crypto industry. So I'm going to keep it tight because we've got 30 minutes and Darren will be waving at me from the back after that. So I'm going to start by asking Laura to introduce herself and also to give us a bit of an overview of what the candidates' positions are when it comes to crypto. So Laura, over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen. So I'm Laura Navaratnam. I'm the UK policy lead for the Crypto Council for Innovation. So we're a US-based member association, but with global policy presence. So I've got the unenviable job of outlining what might be the outcomes from tomorrow. I think I'd start by saying, irrespective of the outcome, I think this is a real opportunity for a reset with industry. The last 4 years have been really challenging for the US, particularly with certain agency leadership. So I think this does allow for that reset between agencies and between industry. You know, the two candidates, Harris has been very explicit that she wants the US to be a leader in emerging technologies and has explicitly mentioned blockchain within that. You know, I would hope, therefore, that she appoints agency leadership that has a more pro-innovation approach and moves away from the regulation by enforcement approach, which has undoubtedly harmed the US in terms of innovation over the last few years. If we have a Trump White House, similarly, he has recognized blockchain and has also recognized the challenges with the SEC's approach. So again, hopeful that he would have a more innovation-focused approach. I do think, in terms of who the president might be, is a very tough one to call at this point. But a lot of how this plays out will be who is kind of what's happening underneath that. So I think it's worth looking at the three likely permutations. I think there's general consensus, if there is ever consensus on these things, that Republicans are likely to take back the Senate. So you have a scenario where you have a Trump White House, a Republican Senate, and a Dem House. I think actually that could be pretty positive for crypto. I think the Senate would want to confirm the agency nominations with the president pretty quickly. I also think you might see a stablecoin bill come quite soon as well. Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who will chair the House Financial Services Committee, has been pretty pro-crypto in the past. So I think you want to see some bipartisan efforts going on. So that could be a place where the Dems are happy to work with the Republicans quite quickly. I think you've then got another scenario, which is, again, Trump White House, but a Republican Senate and Republican House. I think that's probably more kind of positive to neutral, many outcomes that could come there. And I think the challenge there will be, is crypto going to be high enough up the legislative and policy agenda? So I think you could see some positive movement, but it might be slower. I then think you have the third kind of likely scenario, which is a bit more of a wild card, which is a Harris White House, Republican Senate, and a Dem House. That, I think, you will see considerable contention around agency leadership. But I'm hopeful that in Harris's campaigning, she has talked about the importance of being a lead on blockchain, and she would appoint those agency leads appropriately. But I do think she'll be looking for opportunities for bipartisan efforts across a number of different topics. So again, I would hope that a stablecoin bill would be pretty low-hanging fruit, even if it's not getting into kind of market structure at that point. So I think, all in all, irrespective of the outcome, we can be hopeful that we might see some positive progress.
Really interesting, and we're going to come back to stablecoins a bit later and sort of talk about how the rise of stablecoins might be impacting on the sort of status of the US dollar globally. But I'm going to turn to Sophia to introduce herself next and maybe just talk a little bit about how crypto markets have performed under sort of recent administrations and how that affects what's happening now.
Yeah, thanks again for the invitation to be here. I'm Sophia Schluger, Chief Commercial Officer at PVO1. We're a debt capital markets business putting digitally native bonds onto public blockchains. As you can surmise from my accent, I am an American, so obviously this election is near and dear to my heart. I think, if we reflect back on the Trump administration and the Biden-Harris administration, the crypto market and Bitcoin generally has gone through different stages of development and maturation. I would say if you look back in terms of price performance, we've seen, not surprisingly, booms, sort of busts, and recoveries in both administrations. Obviously, I think one thing that's very different between the two is obviously the price point where Bitcoin has been trading, and the fact that, recently, in November 2022, we obviously had the implosion, $1 trillion worth of market cap wiped out from the market due to the FTX implosion. So I think there's not a clear indication in terms of, will past equal future? I think, going back to what was said, it's all going to be about policy, regulation. But what I can say is that I think the good news is that we're entering in a state of maturation of the industry where we're seeing more institutional players come in, better public awareness and education. And so at a minimum, I would expect that the volatility that we have seen in the previous administrations to taper off. Never say never, but if we look back at the two administrations, it's hard to say exactly whether or not that price performance would be a repeat in the future administration. It really will come down to policy and who is at the helm of certain important agencies. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to come to David next. Obviously, we've seen huge growth of interest in the industry, particularly on the institutional side, launch of numerous Bitcoin ETFs in the US. Is this the first crypto presidential election? And what have the actions of the industry sort of been like? And how do you think other jurisdictions are interpreting that kind of more on the global landscape?
I think it's interesting, and it's important to set context here as well, which is obviously everybody's looking at these elections from abroad, seeing exactly what's happening and the level of investment that the crypto industry is putting into putting Trump into power. And I think that is just a very important context, because where you look at that broader issue base when it comes to, say, the EU, APAC countries, and others, you're seeing quite dynamic policy changes from particularly a Trump presidency. And I think that is quite interesting when you layer that across crypto, which frankly, for most citizens, is not going to be something they vote on. They're more interested in women's rights, environment, lots of other issues as well, potential issues with China, etc. So those are the real issues which will be kind of pushing forward the result of the election. But that being said, I think it's interesting that, the lens which particularly the EU and other countries will be viewing that from is the potentially overtly more aggressive stance to China, issues with potential support in Ukraine, for example, and I guess the overall security barrier which the US extends to Europe as well. So it's quite interesting to view it through that dynamic where you're seeing hundreds of millions of dollars floating into presidential campaigns, and actually lots of, I think, political parties in the UK, in the EU, and further afield, looking at that with quite a degree of skepticism. And I think it will be interesting in a few years' time to really see how that plays out, because I think perhaps some of the crypto companies that have invested that level of investment into presidential campaign, they will be viewed with quite a degree of skepticism by policymakers in the EU and UK. I would be interested to see, does that filter through to regulatory structures, and actually whether they're viewed a little bit more sceptical by some of the regulators, particularly in the EU, UK, and perhaps even further afield like Singapore and the Middle East. I just see, the level of investment that's going in from that perspective perhaps hasn't been fully thought through by those that have put that forward.
Yeah, really interesting point. And I want to come to Sean now and ask him to introduce himself and maybe just talk a bit about that, and also about, the assumption is that whichever candidate wins, the US potentially will become more sort of crypto friendly. So what does that mean for the other jurisdictions that are vying for crypto business globally?
Thank you, Helen. Is this working? Great. So I'm Sean Kiernan. I'm the CEO and founder of GreenGauge. We're a Web3 fintech offering crypto-friendly accounts and SME lending. We have a collaboration with Coinbase. The US election for us is fascinating, obviously, as an industry to watch. I've been intrigued to see this, as you say, as a crypto election. I think 60 million Americans hold some form of crypto, and particularly the Stand With Crypto movement has 1.8 million people. In some states, particularly the swing states, the number of members of Stand With Crypto are higher than the swing. So it's definitely a community, and you mentioned the amount of money that's going to candidates. That can actually move, potentially, which elections. This is an issue that people care about. Unfortunately, we don't have as much yet in the UK that kind of mirrors that trending, but I feel that we're also starting to get that a little bit more here. In terms of the impact, we're not just looking at this in terms of the price movements, which are important, but also for the regulatory kind of landscape. Everybody looks to the US. It's still, the dollar is where kind of we've centralized for crypto valuations. Stablecoins particularly are kind of the core of where we've cemented that. And Tether, I know we're kind of, they're a bit of a complex figure, but they're the 22nd largest holder of US treasuries globally, bigger than Spain or the UAE. Like there is real movement now in terms of how this has real world impact for the pricing of the dollar and the global credit markets. So I think the UK, Europe is very closely watching this election. We all are. It will determine kind of the direction of travel. I think either candidate is going to be better, seemingly, than what we have, because particularly the kind of the bogeyman figure of Elizabeth Warren behind the scenes, but Gary Gensler in the fore. The influence of both will seemingly be reduced, whatever that translates into. Either Trump or Harris seem to be a bit more au fait, and they're tapping into the political trends to try to win the votes, which is a good sign.
Yeah, and I mean, you've raised that issue of Gary Gensler, obviously one of the big issues on the industry's mind, and it obviously was a kind of front and center at the Nashville conference where Trump spoke, is, to replace Gary Gensler. But I'm interested in the panel's view also on what form does the crypto friendliness take other than the replacement of Gary Gensler. So, I mean, obviously that's one factor, but there are other kind of bipartisan efforts. There are other bills sort of in the wings. So maybe particularly Laura and David, you might want to comment on, what form does sort of crypto friendliness take under a new administration?
Yeah, I can start. So I think there are a lot of permutations on this, and I think dealing with the SEC question explicitly, like Trump has been very explicit that he would replace Gary Gensler, but he's also been pretty explicit that he would want to, within I think 180 days, have a regime for crypto assets. And as an ex-policy person, I'm an ex-regulator, I think that's hard to believe. However, what it does do is show very strong direction of travel and intent. And I think, that, for example, in the UK is where firms are getting frustrated because they are seeing a lack of clarity and a lack of impetus to move in a particular direction. So even if the US can't deliver it within that timeline, the fact that there is a desire to do it would be very, very positive thing. I think if Harris wins, I think there will be more contention over who those agency leads are. I think she has a list of candidates to replace Gensler as well, but there is a world in which he might move to a different role within the SEC and just not remain as chair. That's not typically, it's not standard, but his contract isn't up until 2026, so there might be some debating around what happens in that short term. As others have said, there's also kind of who is going to be in those other lead positions. Are we going to see Fit 21 move forwards? Are we going to see any market structure bill? So there's sort of lots of pieces at play, I think.
Cool. And I realised I forgot to introduce myself. So I'm David Song from Global Counsel. We're a public policy advisory firm across the world. And I think just on this particular topic, it's, I think, important to realise that there are kind of other dynamics at play as well. Anyone that's worked in regulation for a long period will know that bureaucracies and regulators don't move fast. So even if you change the top of the shop and you change that leadership, actually there's still all of the people that still need to follow that. So one thing I would say is just that it will take time. I think even though there's some excitement around a potential change in leadership and maybe a more pro-crypto narrative, it doesn't necessarily equate to overnight changes. And I think it will take a number of years for those changes to come through. I'd also say the US has been a lot slower and less engaged in international fora. And for those that work in FS, it's obviously very important to realise that IOSCO and some of the other regulatory bodies at kind of global level dictate a lot of policy, and a lot of work has gone into having kind of harmonized frameworks across the globe as it stands at the moment. I think it will be interesting to see how much the US pays attention to those, as they have been involved in them throughout the entire period, but they've been a bit slower off the mark to actually make their imprint on, I guess, a more pro-crypto type narrative on the global stage as well.
Yeah, and I mean, just turning to you, Sophia, obviously one of the other things we talked about in prep was the proposal from Trump to create a Bitcoin strategic reserve. So can you just speak a bit about that as well?
Yeah, I think that was one of the boldest statements that he's made. I think it raised a lot of eyebrows. Obviously, he likes to propose a lot of things, but there's not really a lot of detail or plan behind it. So what would that mean, and what does that mean, obviously, for monetary policy, for, obviously protecting the dollar as reserve currency of the world? It's not clear. If we look internationally to see what other policy leaders, presidents have actually amassed Bitcoin or crypto in size, obviously we look to El Salvador, which I think is leading the charge, buying 1 Bitcoin a day, mining it. They have something like 350 million worth of assets already. You have Bhutan, which actually has twice that amount, surprisingly, also involved in mining. So the question is, how would it function? How would it be managed or interact with existing, legislation and monetary policy? A lot of that is unclear. But we also have to remember this is a candidate who has sold an NFT collection of himself in different outfits, whether being an astronaut in a NASCAR, et cetera. He also
has got one of those. You need to get one right away.
and boasted about making $4.6 million off of that collection. I think he's actually launching a second series if you're interested. Has recently launched, World Liberty Financial, which, in my view is a failed governance token for a protocol that doesn't exist yet, of which, initially they were going to cap the sales at 300 million. They've had to scale that back to 30 million because they have a market cap of $180,000. So, it's bewildering. It's interesting if there is legs to it. However, I would be very skeptical. And obviously, I think the complexity of creating a reserve fund and integrating it with the existing system is too complex for him to actually manage. That's my view.
Really interesting. And I mean, coming back to stablecoins, obviously, the tokenized asset market as a whole, 97% or so, I think, is stablecoins, largely US dollar denominated stablecoins. So what would this potential stablecoin bill do to the stablecoin market? What's the kind of impact if stablecoins continue their sort of meteoric rise in terms of the status of the US dollar? I'd just be interested on the panel's views on that. I don't know if anybody wants to take that. Sean, maybe you can kick off.
I'm super intrigued. There's about $3 trillion of just world trade going on every day, and about 2% of that now is done through stablecoins, if you think of the flows of funds. And that's amazing, considering historically, these didn't exist until a couple of years ago, really at scale. And that's a great fillip for the US dollar. I mean, it's pushing trade towards US and cementing that dollar as the reserve currency, which has impacts for the likes of pound sterling or other currencies, which are maybe less attractive than to be held as reserve currencies, and that impacts the cost of borrowing. So the US has to be talking about this, and I know we've got bills, which the other panelists can talk better than I can on the context, but that are looking to lean into that and say that if the US carves out a space that regulates stablecoins, I think strategic reserves are probably the tip of an iceberg of where the legislation could trend. But the dollarized economies, and El Salvador is the first probably that's going full on into that, won't be the only ones to be looking increasingly than using stable coins more for legal tender daily. And I think that trend to use digital currencies and achieve efficiencies to beat SWIFT, et cetera, could have real impacts, particularly in international trade cross-border as these scale.
Yeah, and we also obviously know that Trump is virulently opposed to any sort of CBDC. I don't know if Harris's position on that is clear, but.
I was just going to build on one point there. I mean, I think it is really interesting to reflect on the fact that despite the, best say, lack of clarity at worst, active dislike of crypto in the US from regulators over the last few years, that the stablecoin market is still incredibly dominated by dollar tokens. So you wonder, even a small incremental movement in a positive direction, what impact that could have. And the US, the truth is, it's for them to lose at this point. So any movement, I think you'll just see a continuing cementing of the existing kind of dollar stablecoin market, and it will make it even harder for other stablecoins to start to develop, because everything is trending towards the US.
Anyone else want to come in on stablecoins? David?
I mean, if last year was the year of the metaverse, this is definitely the year of the stablecoin. We just saw the recent acquisition by Stripe, $1.1 billion for Bridge, which is essentially a stablecoin infrastructure company. So it's indisputable that stablecoins, are here to stay, and the demand for it, particularly in payments in emerging economies, is very strong. Getting access to dollars, obviously the efficiency gains from remittance payments, efficient settlement, quick settlement, low cost, et cetera. So, I think that will continue to grow, and the U.S. Treasury has actually already acknowledged the impact or the presence of stablecoins and how, obviously, it's an indisputable part of the growth of the digital assets industry. So I expect to see more growth in stablecoins, more usage, and yes, a response, a legislative response to the proliferation of them.
Yeah, and then, I guess fast forward 2 years, we've talked about the time it takes to get these things off the ground, but how quickly can the US come back to the table? What do the panel think that we will see in 2 years' time? Maybe we can start with Sean and sort of work our way back round.
Okay, so no crystal balls, but I don't think Gensler will be here anymore, and I think there will be probably some bills that have progressed to, if not Loomis Gillibrand, but at least have some clarity for what the regulatory purview is in the US, which will help to give comfort for businesses to invest. The US has the dominance of unicorns in the crypto industry already, so if they can cement their position even further, I think the UK could be very well placed as a fast follower, if you will, even to take the offices for Europe, as we've seen for, say, Galaxy, Coinbase, they're building here, which is not a bad position to be. I would like the UK to push ahead a little bit further. We'll be doing our digital parliamentarians refresh. We always have Lord Holmes, who's always a great advocate, but the new class of MPs and intake, we'd like to just say who are the people to watch, and we need to have a little bit more traction to know what people there are to follow here. So I'd like to have the UK kind of punch up a bit.
And we have a new Conservative leader, so it will be interesting to see her position on the industry as well. David?
I think from my perspective, I think we'll see the formative steps of legislation in the US, but I don't think yet we will see the kind of real kind of comprehensive approach that we've seen in other jurisdictions. And I think the key question for me will be, has enough momentum, or will enough momentum be gained by that point? Just given the kind of slow-moving nature of legislation, I think looking across to other jurisdictions like the UAE, even the UK from the Property and Digital Assets Bill, but the UAE certainly, they're already stepping into the kind of DAO and Web3 space in terms of regulation. So I think the question is will the US get to that up to speed fast enough, and is that enough essentially to create the environment that's wanted from an investor perspective?
I think we may see some more clarification or change of what's the word? The IRS currently taxes crypto as property. I think we might see some change to that. I think the other thing that we may see, irrespective of the candidate, is more states taking on bolder, perhaps, legislation as it relates to crypto. You look at Wyoming, they've got state-chartered banks that are leading the charge in terms of being able to accept digital assets. So I think where we might see more activity at the state level, but I think it is very dependent upon which candidate wins. And for that, this is not an endorsement, but I think Harris takes it.
Well, I absolutely agree with all the comments made so far. I mean, I guess one additional point is, the debate around security versus commodity is still ongoing, and I think that is something that needs to get addressed pretty quickly. Fit 21 can do that. That was passed in the House back in May, and would have would provide certain steps as to whether something is classified as one or the other, and would raise the bar in terms of consumer protection. So I would like to see something like that making legislation pretty early on, and then I think you've got the groundwork for positive movement in the next 2 years.
Well, thanks so much to our panel. I hope we will all stay up and watch and see what's going to happen. I think David's going to be writing something up tomorrow on the election, so I'm looking forward to seeing his analysis. Thank you very much to all of you for being here, and thanks to Digital Commonwealth for having us to speak first on the day.